Hello and welcome to Baby Steps, presented by BetterHelp. I'm your host, Jordana Abraham, and on Baby Steps, we're exploring the various paths to parenthood that lay ahead when starting a family doesn't come easy. With the help of weekly guests, I'm taking you on my own fertility journey and asking the questions that need to be asked. Trying to have a baby, especially when you experience obstacles, can be a huge emotional and mental challenge. And that's why I invited BetterHelp to join us as the presenting sponsor of Baby Steps. If you're thinking of starting therapy, I recommend giving BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, convenient, and suited to your schedule. Just go to betterhelp.com/babysteps today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/babysteps. Therapy can give you the tools to navigate the difficult transitions in life, and the path to parenthood is definitely one of them. My guest today is Emily Oster, author of Expecting Better and some of my favorite books and articles about parenthood and all the things surrounding it. But before we get to Emily, as always, here's my sister, Dr. Naomi Bernstein.
I'm so excited for this guest. I can't wait to hear your conversation. I love her.
So Emily Oster is she's an economist, which you wouldn't think of as someone you would go to necessarily for parenting advice. But what I love about her, and I follow her on Instagram, and the first time I was pregnant, someone gave me her book, and it was just like a really relaxing way, I thought, to go into pregnancy, because basically what she does is she's not really telling you what to do. She's not giving you advice on what you should or shouldn't do. She's saying here is the actual data. Here are the studies. And you can make that choice for yourself, but you should have the full information. And basically what she was saying also on this episode is doctors don't really tell you this is how much coffee you can have, and the studies show all this stuff, or you can have a glass of wine every now and then. They don't really tell you that. And part of the reason is because it takes too long. I think in medicine, things seem very black and white. So it's much easier to just say, don't drink, don't have any coffee, don't eat sushi. Right. And it takes a lot longer if you're a doctor in a room with a patient going through the entire thing and, what the studies say. So I think her book is really, really helpful and really just takes a lot of because I'm sure from being pregnant 3 times that there's this feeling of every single thing I do feels so dire for this child inside me. And it's all because it's growing inside you. It's not even when the kid is out and the kid at school could make them feel bad or mess them up. Here it's kind of all on you, 100% control, or so it feels right?
Totally. And I love what she's doing with this too, because it really suits kind of the advice that I give a lot of people, which is sort of figure out what you can control, even writing a list of kind of here's the research, here's the information that I have. And once I realize this is the only parts of this that this is the only information that I have, these are the only things that I can control, you can look at that and say, okay, now what? Can I do some of this? Do I want to do some of this? Or do I want to just let this feeling pass through and move forward, just not doing anything? So I'm curious to hear, the conversation that you have, because I think a big part of getting unstuck or making a decision or making a move is gathering all the data and then calmly kind of looking at it and saying, where can I effectuate change within this or not? Versus when it's all in your head and swirling around, when the doctor's well, you could have a glass of wine, but I don't know if it's the best idea. It's kind of well, I don't know. What am I supposed to do with that?
Well, what am I supposed to do with that? Right. Yeah. Exactly. What am I supposed to do with that should be the title of this episode. Yeah, I think that, and I mean, especially with infertility stuff, there's so many decisions that you need to make. So many times you're at a certain point and you're well, should I keep trying naturally or should I try IVF? Should I do IUI before I do IUF? Should I just try naturally and, do the thing that all the annoying people say?
Relax,
and when I relax, it'll come. So it's yeah, right. And maybe I could get pregnant without any of this assisted stuff, or maybe I am overthinking it. And I think there's so many decisions that it feels a lot of pressure to make the right decision because the consequence feels so high stakes. And Emily, you'll hear us talk about this thing where she talks about how there's no secret option C, which is basically saying people delay making these decisions because they think something's going to happen where they're not going to have to make the decision. Something really positive is going to happen where they're going to not, or even negative, I guess. Something's going to come in so that they don't make decisions. And once you accept that there's no secret option C, it kind of forces you into a
Right.
decision, which is good. She
Yes.
says.
And getting to the point where you're like, there's no right or wrong move here. There's just going to be a move and it's going to play out however it's going to play out. And it's not like if I pick A or I pick B that I'm going to turn around and be like, oh, I really regret picking A or picking B. You're going to pick it. You're going to move on. You're probably going to end up feeling better just having made a choice. So yeah,
Right.
it's hard. And that could go for anything in life where you're sort of like waiting for the
Totally.
perfect until you feel 100% about something. It's like you might have to make the choice while you feel 73%. You might not feel 100%.
Yeah. And I think what you just said is so important, like the psychology around it, because like whatever you do, like even if it doesn't lead you to immediate success, you're going to learn something from it. And, that'll inform your next decision. So I feel like there's this pressure of like the right, the wrong decision. It's really just like the decision.
Because you're trusting your own, like, again, with Emily, all the data, it's not like you're just picking one out of a hat. You're gathering all the information. You're making an informed decision with lots and lots and lots, probably of forethought. So then you just have to let it ride and relax into it and realize I put enough positive, hopeful energy and data into this decision that I did the best I could. And now I just have to wait and see.
Agreed. So this was a really helpful episode, I think, for anyone who's kind of like faced with these decisions, feels a little like paralyzed by them. Have a listen. Let's get into the interview. I'm so excited to bring on economist and author Emily Oster. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say, I feel like you are sort of like among my friends who are pregnant or trying to get pregnant, like the way that people pass on maternity pants or something when they're done having kids. Like I got Expecting Better from a friend who was like, I'm done, please take this. And like, it will contain all the information that you need to know to not drive yourself crazy. So I feel like I'm sitting in front of like a hero, not just for me, but among my whole friendship circle of people in their mid and early 30s.
I thought you were going to say, I feel like I'm sitting in front of the maternity pants of authors. It's like, yes, that is a treat. Well, thank you. That makes me very happy.
Well, I'm glad. For anyone unfamiliar with you, you are an economist, which I think at first glance doesn't seem like someone who would be talking about medical stuff or motherhood or anything like that. But can you just kind of explain like what you do and how you got into this and all of that?
Yeah, so I'm trained as an economist, and my sort of specific area of expertise is data and statistical methods. And I was working as an economist, as a professor, and then I got pregnant. And I found myself using the tools from my job, the data part in particular, in the service of my pregnancy, and using statistics to try to think about the right choices about the kinds of questions I think almost everybody has when they're pregnant, like, can I have sushi? Can I have a cup of coffee? And should I have an epidural? And I was doing all this work. And then, as I will sometimes say, like, I took it a little far, and I wrote a book with all of the work in it. So Expecting Better is really a book that came out of my own pregnancy, some combination of my desire to know these things and the training that I had that hopefully will help people know them better.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, it's sort of just like an anxiety reducing thing, because you're not really even really giving advice about what to do or not to do in these books that you're writing. You're really just telling people the facts and the statistics and the studies, not even necessarily the facts, because what is a fact, right?
It's a fact.
Yeah. But you're kind of empowering them to make their own decisions. So if I think your big classic example is coffee in pregnancy, and what the doctors say versus what you say.
Yeah, I mean, I think coffee is a great example because you will get a tremendously wide variety of advice. So people will tell you, we can't have any coffee. People will say, well, you can have 2 cups of coffee. Well, you should ask your barista, like, how much caffeine is in the coffee. And part of what's so frustrating about that is, like, I don't, like, why? People, and this is what I wanted to know, is like, why not? How can I make this choice if I don't understand what I'm trying to avoid and what would be the reason to avoid it? And so much of the book is really like, okay, here's why they tell you to avoid coffee. Here's actually the quality of the evidence to suggest what the actual data says about the possible risks of that and what you should be worried about. And then, you have that. Now you can make whatever choice works for you about coffee or any of these other topics.
Right. Because it seems like most medical advice is sort of meant
to minimize the chances of the doctor being sued in a lot of ways. And I mean, I don't know if you're allowed to say that.
I don't think I would say it. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think there's a piece of that, something called like defensive medicine. But I think there's also a piece of kind of wanting to give people rules that are easy. So if you sort of thought like, what's an easy thing to tell people? It's like, well, an easy thing to tell people is don't have any caffeine. And then it's like, well, because you don't really need caffeine. And I think where a lot of us, this falls down is like, well, actually, I do kind of need caffeine, or at a minimum, I would really enjoy it. It's something that I value and like I like. And so I want to understand, is it actually dangerous, or are you just telling me this because that is sort of the safest way, or because you know that would be safe, as opposed to actually thinking about the risks and benefits.
Exactly. Because when you're at the doctor, the doctor doesn't have like an hour and a half to sort of break down the studies on caffeine and, you know, how some say that you could have 4 cups and some you could, like, it's like you said, it seems like it's probably a lot easier just to give a blanket response. And then like the worst thing that could happen is you don't have coffee when you could have had coffee.
Right.
They probably don't see that as a big deal.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's not a big deal. And it was part of what's interesting about this. You say like, well, what's the big deal? Like, why is it so hard to like avoid caffeine and avoid sushi and avoid all this stuff for 9 months? And on the one hand, like, yeah, that's not a big deal. On the other hand, I'm not doing that in my normal life. And so like I could ask the same thing. Why are you still drinking coffee? You know, as a not pregnant person. Well, it's like, I like it. Okay, well, that's also true for me. And so I think we just want to think rationally about these choices. And I think the book helped people do that. And it's ultimately I think why people like it.
Yeah. And I think it just gives people like the power to make their own decisions, which is awesome. And I mean, it brings me today, we're here to talk about trying to get pregnant, but I do find it interesting as someone who's been trying to get pregnant for like a year and a half, it can kind of feel like you kind of have to follow all these rules of like almost acting as if you're pregnant. But the really sucky part of it is that you don't even get like the upside. You're just kind of getting like the promise that like maybe if you do these things for long enough, or you cut out gluten, or I mean, there's so much on the internet, and like there's so many people who have, you know, the thing that worked for them, the fertility acupuncturist that worked for them, the food, the diet that worked for them, or so they think. So there can be so much out there. And to me, like the idea of following all of these rules and driving yourself nuts when there's, you know, you're not really sure what the data is actually saying or what's important or what's helping you, can lead to feeling like I'm doing all this stuff and I'm not even like in service of a greater good.
Yeah. I mean, I'd sort of separate two things out there. So one is, you know, when you are trying to get pregnant, there's this period where like you could be pregnant. And they used to call it like the 2-week wait, when, you know, after ovulation, before pregnancy, when like you could be pregnant. And then people often feel like, well, I have to, in that period, adhere to all of these complicated pregnancy rules. And, you know, if that's 2 months of that, maybe it's not such a big deal. If it's 2 years of that, well, that's actually a lot of time. Right. And since many of those rules aren't really things you need to be adhering to even during pregnancy, it is, I think, valuable to be like, hey, what would be the reason I would eventually want to adhere to this rule or not, so I can decide whether I want to be doing it for all of this other extra time. The second piece is that in the space of infertility, there is so much magical thinking out there around other restrictions and things like gluten-free, or take this set of supplements, or, you know, stand in this way, or whatever it is, the thing that worked for people. Most of those things don't have a lot of data behind them. Mm-hmm. But for at least some people, I think it is helpful to feel like you're doing something. And so there's a complicated sort of psychology there around kind of, do you want to do something because it helps you feel more in control of the process, even if it probably isn't having any actual impact.
Right. If it's soothing to you in some way, shape, or form, again, it's probably not hurting to be cutting out dairy or something. Right. But
on the other hand, like, you know, it could be like, and so some of those things are more complicated than others. And so, you know, thinking about whether things sort of serve you and serve your mental health is an important part of this.
Well, let's talk statistics, I guess, as it pertains to trying to get pregnant, because I've seen about 10 different statistics on how many months it takes the average couple to get pregnant. about the miscarriage rate, about, the miscarriage rate after one miscarriage. What does the data say about all of this?
So probably the most important sort of organizing principle for all of this, and in a lot of my work, I try to start in this very broad way so people can kind of understand where any answer comes from. So the most important organizing principle is that on average, as you age, it gets more difficult to get pregnant and more difficult to sustain a pregnancy. And the reason for that is that your eggs basically age over time, and the chance of a chromosomal abnormality as a result of a mutation in the egg goes up. And what that means is that as people age, miscarriage becomes more likely, difficulty getting pregnant becomes more likely. And that influences how long it takes to get pregnant, and influences when people are told that they should pursue sort of possible alternative avenues like infertility treatment. So generally, sort of on average, takes couples about 3 months to get pregnant. That's not a super helpful number because, like, what do you mean? Do you mean like 16-year-olds who are like not trying to get pregnant? Because that seems to happen in like a week. It's sort of like, but that's an average number. Generally, if you're sort of under 35, they would say, you want to wait like 6 months of trying before you go pursue infertility treatment. Yeah. As you get older, it's actually less time. And some infertility doctors will tell you basically, if you're trying to get pregnant after 40, just talk to a reproductive endocrinologist immediately. Not necessarily because you're going to want to do something, but because like the chances of needing to have some kind of intervention are much higher.
Right. And you would need to do those interventions sooner.
Yes, exactly. Right. And you're losing time. I mean, this is the other sort of, as you age, you're losing time. And so there's such a fine line here, because on the one hand, some of this is so panic inducing, like every day you're losing time and your eggs are aging, and it's actually the reality.
That's the voice in the back of my head.
That's usually the voice in your head. Yeah. But, the reality is that the decay in your fertility over time, it's there. It starts, more or less as soon as you get your period. Kind of your best time to get pregnant was when you were 16, but there's no cliff, right? Sometimes people tell you about at 35, like your eggs that's it. You're basically done. You're a dried up old hag
geriatric pregnancy.
Geriatric, elderly, preemie gravid. That's the best one. But actually, that's not true. The decline is, reasonably smooth, more or less through your entire, reproductive years. So there's no kind of discrete change in the chance of getting pregnant between 34 and 35.
And I imagine the data doesn't sound that great about how long it should take to try to get pregnant, because you would imagine, I know so many people who get pregnant on the first try, and then so many other people who it takes a much, much longer time for. So the average, it almost kind of feels like it's either right away or like hang in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like an interesting statistical question is, usually we think of numbers as being sort of what we call normally distributed. So like sort of distributed like a bell curve. And if that's true, like the average is really informative. But actually in this case, it's probably not the way the distribution looks. It's probably more like a large share of people get pregnant sort of right away within the first month or two. And then there's a very long tail. So there's people who it takes a very long time. So the average there is like, it's actually not a super helpful number. I mean, the average could be really high, could be 10 months, but actually most people are getting pregnant in 1 or 2 months, but a few people are taking an extremely long time. So I'm just not sure this is a place where the average is a very helpful number.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be the case. At least, anecdotally, that just kind of feels like how it is. I feel like most people are not in that 3 to 6 month range. It's like right away or a year and a half.
Yeah. One way to say that is with, you might expect if you say the average is 3, that would be the most common, but I don't think that's right. Like, I think the most common is almost certainly, in the kind of 1 or 2. And then there's this like large number of people who take a longer time.
And then do you know the statistic for like what % of women who are trying to have kids? And again, I feel like this is if you talk about trying to isolate results, this is probably tougher, because I say what % of women, have infertility problems, but then, you take into account people who maybe like should biologically have less fertility problems, people in their 20s or earlier 30s, and then people in their 40s. It's like, how do you I feel like the data feels like a little confusing in that way, because it would be skewed, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard question to answer. So there are things you can do, like look at historical data from like the 1800s and ask, for people who got married for the first time at different ages, like what is the chance that they got pregnant and like that they ever had any children, which is a sort of very historical metric of like what was the chance of infertility by age. And that's where we see, some of this kind of as you age, it declines. And, people who get married after 45, like generally the chance of having children after that is fairly low, at least in those kind of historical samples. But answering the question you want kind of now is very hard because of the selection of who's in what group and because our data isn't very good. So for a bunch of different reasons.
Right. Which makes it tough to feel like soothed by the data in the infertility space because it's all just feels like the only real statistics they give you are like the % chance that your embryo works even when you do IVF.
Right. And even that is actually varies a lot across provider and varies a lot across time and across people. And is, I don't know. Even that number, even the average there is probably not that helpful.
But I imagine like the data will only get better with something like IVF that's been around, like 30 years-ish?
Yeah. So I think it will only get better. I think the thing that the IVF data is largely missing is this individual component, right? So the chance of getting pregnant with IVF, and I'm assuming you're going to talk to some fertility doctors, and so they can talk to a little bit more about why this is true. But the chance of getting pregnant with IVF is going to vary a lot based on the reason that you're pursuing IVF. So if the reason that you're pursuing IVF is that you have like PCOS, and you're not ovulating, but you're 25 and you have a set of healthy eggs and you have a partner with no sperm, mobility problems, IVF is very likely to work for you because it's going to definitely fix the problem that you have. And sort of similarly, somebody whose problem is a blocked fallopian tube. Okay, well, we know what that problem is. IVF is specifically designed to fix that problem. When the problem is more nebulous, like, you're older and so you have fewer eggs or you have fewer eggs and the eggs are less likely to be viable, then IVF may well work, and it works for a lot of people in that situation, but it's less obvious that it's the direct solution. That's a place where I think we could improve the data. So to be able to tell people more directly, like for people who are coming and seeking fertility help with your particular set of considerations, here is the chance that it will work.
Right. Is there any data on IVF and like the difference between children born from IVF and children born without assisted fertility?
There is a little bit of data on this, and you will sometimes see comparisons of like health outcomes for either babies or moms who have kids through IVF or not. And so, for example, there was a study the other day that said like the risk of stroke, which is extremely uncommon pregnancy complication, but that is higher if you've had IVF. The problem with both that study and this entire literature is that the characteristics of people who choose to have IVF are quite different than people who don't. Not so much choose, but the characteristics of people who end up having IVF are quite different from those who don't. And that makes it really, really hard to compare outcomes for kids and outcomes for parents. I would say sort of looking at it all together, if there are any effects, they are really small, far below where we could reasonably expect to detect them.
Well, that's definitely encouraging. I mean, it's funny, before I did IVF, they show you a video, and it's like, basically the medical disclaimer video about like, that there are increased chances of this, these pregnancy complications in IVF, but they also say the people who are more likely to have done IVF are more likely to have had these other conditions, which have caused them to want to do IVF.
Yeah. And I mean, this is a place where I think I spend a huge amount of my professional time talking about like how important are those differences in driving differences in outcomes. And I tend to think that data like this, which just compares two groups that made different choices and says, well, the difference between the groups is because of this particular choice, that kind of data is bad. And most of the time it's sort of so bad that you basically just can't learn anything from it. And so I usually I'm like, yeah, this data is just trash.
Yeah, I mean, that's most of what I get from reading your newsletter.
Right, most data is trash. Thanks. Yes. That's what my newsletter, it's very constructive. It's like, here's a new study. It's trash, just like the last news study.
Did you think about calling it that instead of...
This study is trash instead of parent data?
Very catchy.
It's good. It's catchy.
This episode of Baby Steps is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's almost the end of the year, and this time, while it can be exciting, can also be really stressful. And a lot of people feel a lot of sadness and anxiety about it. And it's not just the stress of finding gifts, but it's also the stress of seeing your family, of it starting to get cold, a little seasonal depression. But adding something new and positive to your life can counteract some of those feelings. And therapy for me is always something I go to when I'm feeling anxiety or stress around anything, whether it's the holidays, winter, or just like things that are going on in my life that are not going as I planned. I've been to therapy for over 8 years now, and nothing has helped me quite as much as therapy has overcome whatever obstacles come my way. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find your bright spot this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/babysteps today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/babysteps.
Speaking of which, I recently read I think yesterday morning about in your newsletter about studies on stress and pregnancy. And I think for people who have gone through multiple miscarriages or who have spent a lot of time trying to get pregnant, battled infertility, the stress kind of feels like it's like, there's no way it's going to be totally gone.
Yeah.
Right. So I really like that. Because it was basically kind of like part of this, the way I was thinking about it is like, can your thoughts impact your future? How can your thoughts impact your success with this? And people do say positivity is also like helpful for anything, whether you're dealing with cancer or any sort of medical ailment. They say that there's truth in that. Is there truth in that?
I'm sure that there's some interesting literature on positive thinking. In the space of pregnancy, I think people worry a lot about the kinds of stress you're thinking about. Like, I'm worried about this. I'm worried something will happen to the baby. I'm worried about my job. I'm worried, like the sort of standard everyday anxiety stressors that we are having. And I don't think there's much evidence that those affect pregnancy. When we look at the, studies with really extreme kinds of stress, like the death of a spouse, the death of a parent while you're pregnant, it does seem like there are some measurable but really quite small impacts on birth weight. And so this is something that's like good to know, because if you have one of these very stressful events during pregnancy, it's good to be aware of that risk. But the ways that people worry about this, they're worrying too much for the most part about stress. And then, of course, that makes people more stressed. It's like, I'm worried, but now I'm stressed out about being worried. Like, I'm stressed. I'm not meditating enough. I should meditate more. Because it's just like another thing to add to your anxiety bucket is your lack of meditation.
Right. Or your guilt over feeling guilt is a tough one.
Another good one.
Over.
That's another good one.
So, I mean, I think this data is so up on. Another thing, I think, as someone going through like fertility treatments, there's so many options, right? Or it feels like there's so many options. And you have this thing in your newsletter about no secret option C. Can you explain sort of like what that concept is? Because I think about that a lot as it pertains to decisions in this process. If, do I want to go through IVF? Is it going to help? Do I want to, should I just keep trying naturally? All these kind of questions that you ask of yourself.
Yeah. So this idea is really intended to help people kind of work through situations in which you have a choice, and both choices are kind of not like whether they're bad or they're just not the thing you wish was happening. Right. So infertility is a good example. You say, like, I have to choose between like doing IVF or like just continuing to try to get pregnant. And like neither of those are necessarily appealing options, right? Because IVF is physically draining and expensive and has, other, like, it may be emotionally hard to start doing that, but continuing to try, especially if you don't think it's going to work, is also emotionally draining and, takes time and maybe affects your relationship. Like, both of these things are not where you want to be. I think sometimes people will just avoid making the choice because they're waiting for secret option C. Like, they're waiting for just like magically getting pregnant, like with no work. It's like, well, unfortunately, there is no secret option C. Like, these are the only two options you have. And sometimes that kind of mantra, just being like, hey, I actually have to choose one of these. And I get it. Like, neither of them are good, but there's no secret option C. I have to make these options as good as I can and then pick one of them. And for some reason, for me, and I think I'm glad to hear this has helped you too. Like that mantra is really helpful in recognizing the need to move forward. I use it with my kids too.
In order to like help them just actually make decisions.
Just recognize like you're waiting for something that's not happening. So we need to move. You need to choose now. You need to choose one of these two things because you're not magically going to be able to watch television for 6 hours and also do your homework. The day is not going to acquire additional hours so you can secretly do all of these things.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that forces one to make a decision. And then what about dealing with results that you're getting that are sort of like ambiguous? Do you ever as an economist or someone who's, always looking at data, if you get data that's like the data says we don't know. So let's say there's a skincare ingredient. It's like the data, no one's really tested it. How do you deal with things like that?
It's hard to get comfortable with decision-making with uncertainty. And it was something that came up a lot during COVID, actually, was people saying basically, I have to move forward on some choice without having all the information I would like to have. But I think that comes up a surprising amount in our lives to say like, well, in order to take this next step, I have to do something. I have to either use the skincare ingredient or not.
Right.
And that's it. I've acquired all the information I can, which is that we have no idea, or we know very little, or we know a little bit, we know something, but not everything. And getting comfortable with that idea of just having to make a choice and recognizing that you could make the best choice ex ante and it could be wrong ex post. It could have been the wrong choice. That's really hard. And fortunately, most things like skincare ingredients, like you're not going to be too wrong. It's like either I'm sure your skin looks lovely with or without the ingredient. And most of these things are not an especially big deal. But I think it is a skill to learn to move forward when you don't know everything.
Right. And I think people see that all the time because there's so many people, I think, who get infertility diagnoses and like they try to find out what is wrong. And they're kind of like, well, we just really don't know.
I don't know. Yeah.
So it's sort of like, what are you supposed to do with that as a person? I guess you just keep trying seems to be like the answer.
Yeah. Or ask the question like, what would be different if I knew the answer to this? I mean, as people, I think we're always kind of drawn, like we want to have an answer, but sometimes like that's not decision relevant. Sometimes it's like, no matter what would the answer to this, the thing you would do is the same, right? There's like a very famous example of the ways in which people are not good at decision making, in which the sort of frame of the question is you're taking a test, and the question is, do you want to go on vacation? Do you want to take a vacation after this big exam? And it turns out like people, if you say like you failed the exam, they choose that they want to take the vacation. If they say, okay, if you pass the exam, do you want to take the vacation? Yes. They want to take the vacation if they fail. They want to take the vacation if they pass. But they don't want to take the vacation if they don't know whether they failed or passed. Even though no matter what the outcome was, you would want to take the vacation. And I think there's a piece here around how hard it is for us to move forward when there's uncertainty, even if the uncertainty is completely irrelevant for what we would do next. So I want to know why I'm experiencing infertility, even though no matter what the answer is, IVF would be the next step. And sometimes just saying it actually, I wish I knew, but it doesn't matter for the decision. And we just need to do the decision and not think about this.
I think that's great advice, especially because the world that we live in, I think now is one where you as a patient can get so much information where it almost feels like too much information. And then then you become hyper fixated and hyper anxious about every moving part of it. When really, I think if you think about the decision in a meta way of like, I'm going to do the thing anyway, no matter what this little thyroid function test says, or I think it's very easy to get caught up and really hyper focused. And I say that not just for myself, but for all the Reddit threads online for IVF and infertility. And it's kind of like if anyone else were to read them, they would be like, first of all, this is like people speaking a totally different language.
Right. Yeah. I don't know what any of these words are.
Right. Is this actually helping to be like so intensely deep diving into every little thing that could go wrong, or your doctor prescribes you this dosage and someone else online's doctor prescribed them that slightly higher or lower dosage?
I mean, I think there's a question of separating sort of worry from action, and that worry isn't usually serving us if there is not a choice to be made. If we're just just worrying,
Right.
that's not moving us forward.
That's what I told myself right before I deleted the
Reddit.
thread. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think was a good move.
That was a good choice.
Yeah. I think that, it's kind of like there is a certain element, I think, of like trusting in the system, which, as you said, like if you look at the data on a meta level, which is what you do every day, like generally seems to work for most people. Not that it works for everyone, which leads me to like really my last question for myself and for the listeners of like, is there data on if you are trying to have a baby, the general statistic for which that will eventually happen?
I don't think that there's data that will answer that question in the way that you want, is maybe what I would say. So there are statistics we could say, like among people who get, married and start trying to have a family at 25, how many of them get pregnant? It's a very large number. It's the vast majority. But I don't think that number is helpful for some of the same sort of average time to pregnancy reasons we talked about before. Because once you are in a space where it's hard and you haven't immediately gotten pregnant, then there's way more heterogeneity. There's way more variation across people. And I also am not sure it's always helpful for people to have a number here. The number is not going to be 100%. It's not going to be 0%. And so thinking about how to move forward in a place where you can't be guaranteed that this will work, but also it might. That's kind of the challenge.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the ultimate mind game of all of this kind of stuff, right? Although also knowing that there are alternatives to, having a family.
I mean, I think, so for me, that piece of kind of thinking about either by yourself or if you have a partner, with your partner, kind of before you embark on some either an initial fertility journey or particularly if you're sort of pursuing infertility treatment, it's actually worthwhile having a conversation about how far down this road are we going to go and what are the other alternatives we would consider to grow our family. And for some people, there are a lot of things that would be on that table, and for some people there are fewer, but it feels like a conversation that probably wants to happen earlier rather than later.
Right. And it can be so weird, I think, to like, or not, weird is probably not the right word, but it can feel, I think, kind of sad or depressing to even have that conversation, because it almost feels like by saying something is an option, then you are
saying that the other thing is not going to work.
Right.
Yeah. But that's not true. I mean, that's not the way that works.
The data says that's not true.
That's not true.
Okay.
That's not true. And I think, people's psychologies around this differ, but I think for a lot of people, actually there is a fair amount of value in having thought about that in advance, because you may end up, it may be harder to think about it down the road.
Right. And for me, at least, for every step of what I've been through, I feel like the idea that I would have done IVF when I started trying to get pregnant seemed like so crazy and so far off. But then by the time I had decided to do it, it was kind of like, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. Like almost like the more your mind can get used to the thought of something, the less like crazy it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then like there's a space for following up on all these conversations. And, I think when people first start thinking about getting pregnant, they rarely have this conversation. That's probably fine, because for a lot of people, it works right away. It's once it doesn't that I think you start wanting to get on the same page. Well,
this has been so helpful. I, again, feel like I have been speaking to one of my idols in this space, because this is, this becomes like a large part of what I consume. And the best part about following you on Instagram, and you guys should all go follow Emily on Instagram. What's your Instagram handle?
It's Prof. Emily Oster.
Prof. Emily Oster. I watch your Q&As on Wednesday, and even as someone who doesn't have kids, I actually really enjoy the ones about having kids, because it just goes to show me that like the stress doesn't really end.
No.
Once you get there. It's like not, because in your head, I think when you're trying so hard to achieve something, you're like, well, once I have it, then I won't be stressed about anything. And I see the questions that people ask you, and I'm like, oh, they might be even like more stressed than I am. So in some way that's soothing. I don't know why.
No, I think it is. It's like it's always interesting to see like, everyone else is also really anxious. Like, that makes me feel better.
Right. Everyone else is overanalyzing,
Exactly. I'm not alone.
Exactly. But thank you so much for coming on. Where can everyone find you? I know you have so many different things going on. You have their newsletter, podcast?
So the best place is parentdata.org, where you can subscribe to the newsletter and you can search all of the stuff that I've written about parenting and pregnancy, and Instagram, where it's Prof. Emily Oster.
Great. And the parent data, now you now also have like a search engine, right?
Yeah, so parentdata.org will get you to the website where you can search, or you can ask our chatbot, whose name is Dewey, who will answer questions.
Amazing. I mean, like that's kind of like the dream, because, you know, I told you in the beginning, I'm not sure if I was on air, but I DM'd you because I'm like, I have these questions. I don't know anyone who knows the answer. You know the answer, but now you've created a system.
The chatbot knows the answer. Yeah, sometimes it's better. Sometimes people will be like, your answer's not that great, but Dewey really knew. Dewey was so nice. Somebody was like, Dewey's so nice. I think they meant it in contrast, but anyway.
Better bedside manner.
Yeah, Dewey has a really nice bedside manner. It's like the sweetest chatbot.
Well, it's easy to not get jaded when you're a robot.
I totally agree.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on. I will be continuing to follow you, and I know the listeners will get so much out of this episode. So thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Emily. I'm such a huge fan and continue to be. This was super helpful. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, BetterHelp. We hope this episode has been a help to you on your path to parenthood. If you want to get started with therapy, I highly recommend trying BetterHelp. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Visit betterhelp.com/babysteps today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/babysteps.
Betches.